If you're studying visual communication design, it's really helpful to know how communication works. And semiotics is a really helpful field of study for that. Semiotics is the study of signs and representation, which is something that helps us make meaning of images. So if I show you this sign and I ask you what it represents, you would know that this is the sign for money. And if I ask you how you know that, you would say, well, it's just always associated with money. But this sign actually doesn't appear on dollar bills. It's something that we learn through association. Same thing if I show you this. If I show you this icon, you know that this represents the application Snapchat, but Snapchat is not, the outline of a ghost. It's an application where you send and receive pictures and messages. You know this because you see this icon associated with that application on your phone if you use it. If I show you this, you would tell me that this is a traffic light, but this is actually not a traffic light. You know this is a traffic light, or you think that it's associated with a traffic light because certain things that you typically associate with that object are represented here, such as the shape of the rectangle and the colors that are there and the order of those colors. So I can show you this, and you can see that these two images are similar. But this is also not a traffic light. This is a photograph of a traffic light. So this is a sign for that thing, that physical thing in real life. The study of signs in semiotics can be represented by this equation. A sign is a signifier plus the signified. So in our example of money, the dollar sign is the signifier for the currency money, which is the signified. And these signs can be categorized into three different groups. We have icons, which look like the thing that they are meant to signify. We have indexes, which are associated or cannot exist without the thing that they are signifying. And we have symbols, where the signifier has to be learned to be associated with the signified object. So in the example of the bicycle here, the icon of the bike looks like a bicycle, and that is exactly what it's meant to represent. The skull and crossbones, however, represents death, but death doesn't look like this. Skull and crossbones is something that can't exist without death, and so that is why this is an index. And then the final one, we're not sure what this means. This has to be learned or associated with the thing that it represents. So for example, letters are symbols. The money sign is a symbol because we have to learn to associate it with the signified object. We can take this a little bit further when we think about the example of the traffic light. So for example, a traffic light is made up of, that rectangular shape that we looked at, those three different circles, which are the lights, and three specific colors. Those things don't by themselves represent what this is meant to signify. We have to learn that a traffic light represents different levels of permission for passing through an intersection. So the traffic light itself is a symbol for the permission to pass through the intersection. We can also push this further because we learn what a traffic light means. We start to associate the color green with go, even outside of the context of the use of the traffic light. In another example, we can think about the house. So what makes a house a house? Well, it has walls, it has a roof, it has windows, it has a door. But what a house represents can be more than just those things. So it can represent comfort, safety, family, anything else you might associate with a house or your home. And this gets into another thing that's worth talking about with semiotics, which is denotation versus connotation. So the denotation of something is the visual facts or the literal meaning of the thing. In the example of the traffic light, this is that shape with three lights. In the example of the house, this is the four walls with the ceiling and the windows and the roof and the door. But the connotation is the subjective interpretation of those signifiers. So this would be like the permission for the traffic light or the representation of comfort and family for the house. These are associated meanings, and these can change based on context or individual. This we can call a semantic network, which is how we associate different concepts together. This depends on the person, and this can change over time. And we can investigate these semantic networks by looking at concept maps, which is a visual representation of these things. So, for example, if we look at a concept map of a car, we can see that a car can be used to drive. We can see that it is a vehicle which is used for mobility. We can look at the different parts of the car. It's almost like a brainstorm or a word cloud, but the different parts are very clearly related together. And we'll talk more about that. If we start to associate things or look at things that are multiple steps away from each other, we start to find really interesting ideas here. So, for example, if we look at the concept of driving, we can see that it's several steps away from the opportunity to or the motivation of seeing the world or traveling. This helps us avoid cliches, to find metaphors, and to discover new ideas when we're coming up with visual symbols. Which is why when you watch a car commercial, the act of driving is always or often associated with this idea of exploration or the larger motivation of what people want to do with a car rather than just get from point A to point B. This starts to look a lot like marketing and is why it's useful when we talk about visual communication design. When those contexts change, our associations can also change. So if we take the act of driving and put it in a totally different scenario, or we take the color green and move it from the idea of the traffic light and put it somewhere else, let's say in a healthcare setting, green might mean sick instead of go, for example. So those associations change depending on where we see them. And this can help us think about a theory called linguistic relativity, which is the theory that language or collections of signs actually influence how we think. So language and writing are not just ways that we communicate what we are already thinking, but it becomes the medium by which we actually do that thinking. And so the words we use and the context we put them in is really, really important. And those subtle changes and nuances can be really powerful in terms of shaping communication or culture. When we think about how communication actually works, so how do we get from signs to that actual transmission of information, we should start to look at some models for that as well. So if we look at this famous design by Paul Rand for the IBM logo or an alternative for it, we might describe this as playful. You know, we can see the visual metaphor of the I, the B, and then the M, and think that that's sort of clever to take those signifiers and then divorce them of their typical denotation. So what an I literally is, to think about the symbol of the letter I, same thing with the B. But if someone else looks at this, they might think something totally different. So this quote from Cheryl D. Miller, who's a famous designer, says that I would like to retire the Paul Rand look. I would like to retire mid-century Helvetica. I want to retire flush left. I want to retire white space. It is the look of my oppressor, a mid-century era when it wasn't easy to enter the New York marketplace as a black designer. When I see that look, the only thing it says to me is you cannot enter. So Cheryl D. Miller is a black designer, and this symbol means something different to her than it might mean to someone else, for example. So, which interpretation of that sign is correct? Well, both of them are correct, which is why we do so much critique and so much testing in design, because our goal is to have an accurate communication for the largest percentage of our audience as possible. The way that this works is there is a transactor which encodes a message and then passes that through a channel to the audience or another transactor. And they need to decode that message. So they need to take what they see or what they hear and figure out what that means to them. And then if there is conversation, if there is a feedback loop, then the second transactor or the second person might encode their own message and pass it back to the first person. This is what's happening when we talk with people back and forth when you have a conversation. This is what's happening when you exchange text messages or emails. It all kind of fits into this loop of encoding and then decoding information. So what we're attempting to do is we have a message we want to communicate. We want to successfully encode that message into a communication channel. Maybe this is a poster. Maybe this is an advertising campaign. Maybe this is a video. And then we want the audience to successfully see that message, first of all, and then decode it and understand what we wanted them to take away from it.